I was 58 when it happened, old enough to think I'd seen it all, that life had stopped offering surprises. My husband, Greg, and I had been married for 32 years by then. Solid. Familiar. The kind of love that creaks like the floorboards of an old house, not always exciting, but full of history, full of us. We lived in a modest 2-story home just outside Asheville, North Carolina. Quiet neighborhood. Good folks. The kind of place where your neighbors wave even if they don't know your name. I spent most of my days tending the little garden out back and spoiling our golden retriever, Daisy. Life was calm, predictable, and I thought complete. Then came that autumn weekend. Greg had invited his old college buddy, Mark, to stay with us for a few days. They hadn't seen each other in years. Decades, maybe, but kept in touch through birthday calls and the occasional email. I'd met Mark just once, back in the early 90s. Back then, he was this charismatic guy with wild ideas and a contagious laugh. Life had pulled them in different directions, but the bond stayed. Greg said it was time to reconnect. When Mark arrived, it was like someone opened a window and let new air into our home. He was different. Older, of course. We all were. But something about him had changed. Softer, maybe. Still charming, still quick with a story or a joke, but now he carried this quietness, this gentle weight that lingered behind his eyes. He had that silver-gray hair that looked like it belonged in an ad for high-end whiskey, and his voice had mellowed into this deep, soothing tone that you could fall asleep listening to. That first night we sat on the porch, sipping bourbon under the string lights, while the trees rustled like they were whispering secrets. The men talked about the past, college pranks, old flames, dreams they chased and lost. I mostly listened, laughing when appropriate, occasionally chiming in. But I kept watching Mark. There was a moment, fleeting, so small I almost missed it, when our eyes met across the rim of his glass, and something passed between us. Not flirtation, not desire, but something. Vulnerable. As if he saw something in me that I hadn't felt in years. I brushed it off. Bourbon does that to you. Makes moments heavier than they are. The next day, Greg had to leave for a few hours to help his sister with her car. Mark and I were left alone in the house. It wasn't awkward, exactly. But it wasn't easy either. I was in the kitchen, rinsing mugs, when Mark appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame like it was 1992 again, and I was still the curious wife of his best friend. "I owe you a story," he said, half smiling. "Oh," I replied, trying my hands. He nodded, stepping in. "Last night, when Greg talked about his old job in Atlanta, the one I helped him get, he left something out." I looked at him, confused. "What?" He sat at the kitchen table, exhaled slowly. "I was in love with someone then, someone I never told Greg about." I turned, leaning on the counter, suddenly aware of the stillness around us. Even Daisy was curled up silently in the corner. "She was older than me," he continued. "Married, kind, elegant, smart as hell. She'd smile, and the whole room would shift. We never crossed lines, but she made me realize I was capable of more than the shallow flings I used to chase." I felt my breath catch, unsure why. And I never told her. I never even told myself, really, until it was too late. He looked up at me. "You remind me of her." The silence stretched, long and warm, not heavy. "Mark," I said softly. He shook his head, smiling gently. "I'm not trying to make things weird. I just needed to say it. Maybe for her. Maybe for me." We talked for hours that day. about things I hadn't spoken of in years, about aging and love and the quiet ache of dreams deferred, about loneliness, not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from not being truly seen. Somewhere in those conversations, I realized I'd buried a part of myself long ago. The woman who once painted late at night, who danced barefoot in the kitchen when no one was watching. Mark saw her. There was no affair, no inappropriate touch. Just a shared moment in time. A deep emotional honesty that neither of us expected. That evening, Greg returned, full of grease and stories about his sister's stubborn car. The spell had passed, but something inside me had shifted. And over the next few days, I began to see my world with fresh eyes. Mark left on Monday morning. I stood in the doorway in my cardigan and slippers, coffee warming my hands as I watched him load his suitcase into the trunk of his rental. He waved, gave Greg a firm hug, and turned to me with a smile that held just a second too long. "Take care of each other," he said. Greg chuckled. "We always do." And then he was gone, just like that. No dramatic exit. No unresolved glances or whispers left hanging in the air. But something had changed in the house, in me. It's a strange thing when someone reminds you of who you used to be. They don't give you anything new, really. They just hold up a mirror and say, "See, she's still there." For days after Mark left, I found myself thinking about that conversation at the kitchen table, the way he spoke about that woman from his past, the longing, the honesty in his eyes, and the fact that he said I reminded him of her. It stirred something in me I hadn't felt in years. Not desire. Recognition. It wasn't about romance. Not really. It was about being seen, being heard beyond the routines of everyday life. Greg and I loved each other. We always had. But we'd fallen into the quiet rhythm of long-time marriage. Comfort over curiosity, habits over hunger. That week, I started noticing things. Little things I hadn't paid attention to in years. I opened my old sketchbook, the one I hadn't touched since our youngest moved out. Dust scattered across the cover like fine powder. I flipped through pages of unfinished drawings, hands, flowers, faces I no longer recognized. That night, while Greg watched TV, I sat by the window and began to sketch again. My fingers trembled, unused to the movement, but something loosened in me, a kind of quiet joy I thought was long gone. Greg didn't say much about Mark's visit. He seemed content, maybe even relieved, to reconnect with an old friend. He'd mentioned Mark in passing, a memory here, a joke there, but never asked what we'd talked about while he was gone. I wondered if he noticed the shift in me. I wondered if he even saw it. One evening, I finally brought it up. "Did Mark ever tell you why he never married?" I asked, setting the dinner plates on the table. Greg paused, mid-sip of his iced tea. "Nah," he said. "I figured he just liked being free. You know Mark. He was always kind of a lone wolf." I nodded slowly. "He loved someone once. Didn't tell her." Greg raised an eyebrow. "Did he tell you that?" I looked down at my napkin, smoothing it out. "He did." He said, chewing thoughtfully. "Funny. I guess we never really talked about that kind of stuff." It struck me then how men, even close friends, could go decades without sharing the things that mattered most. The ache, the regrets, the quiet what-ifs. That night in bed, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan spinning above us. Greg was already snoring softly beside me. I turned toward him, watching the rise and fall of his chest. We had built a life together, a good life. 2 kids, a home, shared memories stretching across 3 decades. But somewhere along the way, I had become invisible. To him, to myself, and I wasn't sure whose fault that was. A few days later, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address, just my name, handwritten in neat cursive. Inside was a single sheet of paper. She wore sadness like perfume, faint, beautiful, and lingering in every room she left. No signature, no explanation. But I knew. My heart fluttered in my chest, not from romance, but from recognition. He had seen me. He had written me. And more importantly, he had reminded me of myself. That evening, I showed Greg the note. I watched his eyes scan the line slowly, trying to understand it. He looked up at me, confused. "Who sent this?" "I think it was from Mark." He frowned. "Why would he send you something like that?" I smiled gently. "Because sometimes people say the things we don't know how to say to each other." Greg was quiet for a long time. Then, to my surprise, he reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm sorry," he said, "if I ever made you feel unseen." The words caught me off guard. I didn't cry, but something inside me softened. We sat there, 2 people who had weathered a lifetime, finally finding the courage to speak in the quiet spaces between us. Mark had come and gone, just a visitor in our lives, but the gift he left behind was far more lasting than I ever expected. He reminded me that it's never too late to wake up inside your own life. It's funny how something as simple as a few handwritten words can shift the ground beneath your feet. That quote from Mark, "She wore sadness like perfume," lingered in the corners of my mind for days. It wasn't sorrowful, not really. It felt intimate, like someone had peeled back a layer of my soul and spoken the truth I didn't even realize I'd hidden. I kept the paper tucked inside my journal, beneath dried leaves I had pressed in my 40s, back when I still thought I had all the time in the world to chase beauty and meaning. I'd sit by the window some mornings and reread it, not because I missed Mark, but because it reminded me I had a story too, one I'd stopped telling myself. Greg had softened since the letter. There was a gentleness to him now that I hadn't seen in years, not because he hadn't loved me before, but because we'd forgotten how to really talk. Life had become about grocery lists and appointments, not about who we were inside. And suddenly, he seemed to be searching for me again. One Saturday morning, he surprised me. "I signed us up for a painting class," he said, holding out a flyer like it was a peace offering. I blinked. "You? What?" He grinned. "It's at the community center. Thursday evenings. Beginner's welcome." I couldn't help but laugh. "You've never held a paintbrush in your life." "I know. But I figured maybe we could start something new together." The truth was, it touched me more than I knew how to say. Not because I needed a painting class, but because he was reaching across the silence that had crept into our marriage. He was trying. The first class was clumsy. Greg splashed more paint on his jeans than on the canvas. We sat next to each other in metal chairs, surrounded by retirees and hobbyists, all of us grinning awkwardly as the instructor guided us through still lifes and color blending. But something beautiful happened in those evenings. I watched Greg tilt his head, eyes squinting in concentration as he tried to match the shade of a peer. I saw the same boyish determination I'd fallen in love with so many years ago. And he watched me too, not just glanced, but truly saw me. The way my hand moved across the canvas, the way my shoulders relaxed when I was focused, the way I smiled without even realizing it. One night after class, He reached over as we drove home and took my hand. Just held it, gently, like he was anchoring himself to the moment. "You're really good," he said. I looked at him, surprised. "You don't have to say that." "I'm not just saying it." He glanced over, eyes kind. "You look alive when you paint." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My fingers squeezed his quietly. It wasn't that everything changed overnight. We still had our old routines, bills to pay, errands to run, dishes to wash. But beneath it all, something was blooming. We were both remembering who we used to be and realizing we still had room to grow. One night, weeks later, as we sat on the porch with tea and a blanket draped over our knees, I brought up Mark again. "Do you ever think people come into our lives not to stay, but to shake things up?" I asked. Greg looked thoughtful. "Yeah," he said. "Like a stone tossed into still water. Ripples you don't see right away." I nodded. He reminded me that I'd stopped looking at the world with curiosity, and maybe that I'd stopped looking at you that way too. He was quiet for a while. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "I was jealous of him." I turned surprised. Jealous. "He saw you, in a way I hadn't in a long time, and you glowed when you talked to him." I noticed. I just didn't know what to do with it. I touched his arm. "You could have asked me." He smiled, sheepish. "I'm learning." We sat there in silence for a while, the crickets filling in the gaps. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not just love, but partnership. Two people learning how to hold each other again. Not out of duty, but out of choice. Later that week, I started painting again on my own. Real painting, not classroom exercises. I set up a little corner by the upstairs window, where the afternoon light spilled in golden and warm. I painted landscapes at first, misty hills, distant cabins, empty roads that curved towards soft horizons. And then one evening, I painted a woman. She was older. Her face was soft, lined with time, but her eyes sparkled with something wild and unspoken. I didn't realize until I stepped back that I had painted myself, not the version in the mirror, but the one I had forgotten, the one who still dreamed. And I cried. Not from sadness, from remembering. Spring came early that year. The dogwoods in our backyard bloomed like lace against the trees, and the air smelled of new beginnings. I spent more time outside, setting up my easel beneath the sun-dappled leaves, painting the same view in different lights. Daisy would curl up at my feet while I lost myself in colors and silence. It was peaceful. It was enough. Greg and I were better. Closer. Not perfect. We were still the same stubborn, aging pair we'd always been, but something had healed. Like a joint that had long ached suddenly sitting just right in its socket again. The kind of comfort that didn't need words anymore. Just knowing glances, shared coffee, a hand brushing your back as you passed in the hallway. Then the second letter came. It arrived tucked in a plain white envelope, no return address again. But I knew. This time, it was longer. "I'm not writing to disrupt anything." It began. "I just wanted you to know. I've started painting. Terribly. Sloppy strokes, muddy colors, a mess, really. But when I paint, I feel connected to that quiet truth we shared. I think that was the gift, not the moment, but what came after. You reminded me that emotional honesty still matters, even at our age. You reminded me that a connection doesn't have to be forever to be meaningful. I carry that with me, and I hope you carry yourself with the same tenderness. Thank you for seeing me, and for letting yourself be seen. M." I folded the letter and sat with it for a long time. There was no spark of temptation, no rush of nostalgia, just a stillness, like standing in a cathedral after the music ends. Mark had become a chapter, not a secret, not a wound. A chapter, important, but not the whole book. I told Greg about the letter that evening. We were sitting in the living room, a fire crackling in the hearth. I handed it to him without a word. He read it slowly, brow furrowed, then exhaled through his nose. "He's right," he said finally. "That moment changed something. But I think it changed it for good." He looked up at me. "You've come back to yourself, and I'm sorry it took someone else to show me that." I walked over and sat beside him on the couch. It wasn't just him. It was me too. I'd let pieces of myself get buried under the years. I thought maybe that part of life was done, the growing part, but it's not. Not yet. He took my hand, warm and worn with time. "Then let's grow together, however late the season." That spring, we started going on long walks again. The kind we used to take when we were young, when the world still felt like a mystery we could solve hand in hand. We talked about the kids, the grandkids, our dreams for retirement. We even started planning a little trip, just the two of us, to a cabin in the mountains where the cell signal was weak and the stars were strong. And I kept painting. I painted not for recognition, not for praise, but for myself, as a way to stay alive inside. Sometimes I'd paint Greg, reading by the window or sipping his coffee in the golden morning light. Once I caught him smiling at one of my canvases when he thought I wasn't looking. "You've a light in you again," he said softly. It made me think, maybe that's what love is after all. Not just the decades and the bills and the small talk over dinner, but the courage to look at someone, really look, even after 30 years, and say, "I still want to know who you are." And sometimes that knowing begins again because someone outside the story pauses long enough to point to the parts we forgot were still shining. Mark never wrote again after that second letter, and that felt right. Like a song ending on just the right note, not unfinished, not longing, just complete. Looking back now, I don't think his visit was about romance or regret or lost chances. I think it was about reminding two people, me and Greg, that we were still capable of discovery, of death, of seeing each other with fresh eyes. At 58, I found a version of myself I hadn't seen since I was 30. At 59, I fell in love with my husband again. And now, as I sit by the window with a brush in my hand and Daisy snoring at my feet, I can say, truthfully, that sometimes the most unexpected moments don't take you away from your life. They bring you home.